welcome to an exclusive coverage of the remembrance of the Vietnam War. I am Michael Scott, your host, and in this segment we have an expert, Megan Gray from the Asian Institute of History, and a voice from the outside. Here's some background knowledge about the Vietnam War. In 1930, the French began to exploit Vietnam's natural resources. Vietnam was a source of tea, rice, coffee, pepper, coal, zinc, and tin. Due to the fall of France during World War II, the Japanese took over Vietnam. A Vietnamese Communist army led by Ho Chi Minh rebelled against the Japanese and eventually declared independence in 1945. After the defeat of the Japanese in 1945, there was a power struggle between the Vietnamese nationalists and the French, which led to the First Indochina War. The Indochina War period between 1945 and 1954 was terrible, during which the Vietnamese were trying to decolonize, but were stuck in a stalemate with the French. Eventually, the war ended when the Vietnamese, led by Minh, successfully attacked the French airbase Dien Bien Phu. While this victory marked the end of the French presence in Vietnam, the Vietnamese were yet to gain full independence. Vietnam was yet to suffer 20 more years of conflict during the Vietnam War before it was able to enjoy peace and begin rebuilding. We go to our expert who has a main reason why we lost Vietnam to the communists.
Before we get started, we need to go over which countries were involved in this matter. This includes the good, the bad, and the neutral. The good countries were the US and South Korea, who provided troops and supplies to South Vietnam. The neutral countries included Laos and Cambodia, who were attacked by bombardments in the midst of this war. France was a special case because they were occupying Vietnam first for their resources, but left when they were losing to Minh and did not return because of the war in Vietnam. The enemies of the democratic ideals were China and the Soviet Union. They were enemies of America because they supported communism.
Alright, thank you, Megan. Let's go forward and go over what main events pushed the Vietnam War to ignite.
And I would like to talk about today include the Geneva Accord, the protests in America, and the Watergate scandal. Let's start with the Geneva Accords. In 1954, the Geneva Accords were created to establish North and South Vietnam. The agreement also specifies that elections are to be held within 2 years to unify Vietnam under a single democratic government, but those elections were never held. North Vietnam forces began to build a supply route through Laos and Cambodia to South Vietnam, which later was known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Ho Chi Minh was later replaced by Le Duan as head of North Vietnam's ruling Communist Party. Next are protests in America. The protests kickstarted the idea of keeping troops or taking them back to America. In 1965, President Johnson called for 50,000 more ground troops to be sent to Vietnam, increasing the draft to 35,000 each month. Nearly 300 Americans were killed and hundreds more injured in the first large-scale battle of the war. Then, huge Vietnam War protests occurred in Washington, D.C., New York City, and San Francisco. On April 15, 1967, large-scale anti-war protests were held. Finally, the Watergate scandal stalled and evidently was the main reason why the U.S. government pulled away from Vietnam. The Watergate scandal in 1973 was the main event that led to the loss of Vietnam. This event erupted because burglars were caught wiretapping phones and stealing documents. This all was tied to President Nixon, who was doing this to rig the next presidential election. He tried to cover it up, but was caught and seen more guilty. It had cost America's time and money because it had stalled the presidential election, plus it put the U.S. government in turmoil.
Thank you so much for this information. But do you think you can go and elaborate on the role of the Soviet Union and the United States in the Vietnam War?
Indeed, the United States was the main contributor to this war. They got involved because they wanted to save Vietnam from communism. They provided weapons, military, and the main drive for the South's retaliation towards communism. As the South was being attacked, the American nation came in to support and protect it from the Communist Party. America's goal was to save Vietnam and help them forge a democratic society. On the other hand, the Soviet Union got involved because they wanted to spread the idea of communism. When men needed supplies, the USSR said yes and helped them out. They began to send weapons, supplies, and military out to North Vietnam, which provoked America. Their goal was to spread the rule of communism towards North Vietnam and around the world.
With all this madness happening, how was the war resolved?
Well, Michael, it didn't happen overnight. In the end, the Communist Party won and took over Vietnam. Due to the protest and the Watergate scandal occupying America, it caused them to stop their support towards South Vietnam. With this, America was in a controversy. People wanted to save Vietnam and others wanted out. It caused America to go against each other, but the government finally agreed to pull out. The war also suffered greatly. People from Vietnam were forced to suffer from the gulags, re-education camps, and being refugees to flee from Vietnam. This also was the reason why the Cambodia genocide occurred, which in turn killed about 2 million people.
Thank you for all this information and review of the Vietnam War. We will go to Jim Halper and an audience member inside our interview room for their ideas on how the Vietnam War affected us. Hi, Jim. Let's see what she has to say. Well, Michael, we have Marie Allen here to answer our questions. All right, Marie, let's get started. Why might this event still be relevant to today's society?
Being American, it reminds us of how the U.S. helped throughout much of the war, but at the same time, costed many lives.
Why should we care?
We should care because through our pride and leadership, we attempted to bring the idea of freedom to Vietnam, but in the end caused destruction upon ourselves. This should not be repeated, and we must learn from our past mistakes in order to be a better nation.
Do you still see the impact of this event?
Yes, I still see the impact of the Vietnam War today. Veterans experience PTSD, and families from this war continue to suffer. Families from Vietnam have been traumatized and broken from being in the gulags and being refugees. The Vietnam War continues to have a negative impact.
How should we feel or view this event from today's point of view?
From today's point of view, we the people should view this event in a serious manner, in respect for all the living and fallen soldiers, the civilians who suffered, and anybody who supported to save Vietnam.
Marie, now let's get back to you, Michael. Those were all my questions. Thank you, Jim and Marie, and thank you to everyone for joining us. This is all we have time for today. Please, be safe and enjoy life. This is Michael Scott from The Office, signing off.